The Galactic Council faced humanity and begged for extinction. The transport shook when the docking clamps locked on, not from turbulence, not from engine failure. It shook because Nexara Station was the size of a small moon, and every time something docked against its hull, you felt the mass of it in your bones. I had been on large ships before. I had drifted past gas giants in observation pods and stood on the surface of Mars during a dust storm that turned the sky the color of dried blood. None of that prepared me for the weight of this place. My name is Sira Voss. I am 39 years old. I grew up in a small town in northern England where it rained 11 months out of 12, and the 12th month everyone agreed was probably also rain in disguise. I became a pilot because I wanted to go somewhere the sky did not end. I became a diplomat because I was apparently the only human who could sit in a room full of beings that had 17 limbs and a collective lifespan older than civilization, and not flinch. That is not bravery, that is something else. I have never found a word for it. The corridor from the docking bay to the reception chamber was a quarter of a mile long. The walls were made of a material that looked like dark glass and occasionally pulsed with a faint amber light, as if the station itself were breathing. 2 Vethali guards walked ahead of me. They were tall, thin, and moved without making a sound, which I found more unsettling than if they had been loud. Behind me walked my aide, a 26-year-old from Cardiff named Owen Price, who had been recruited because he had a perfect memory and the ability to remain calm in situations that would make most people reconsider their career choices. Owen leaned close and spoke quietly. The charge document came through on the encrypted relay while we were in the docking queue. "I know," I said. "Did you raid it?" "3 times. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." We kept walking. The charge document had arrived 4 days ago, while the transport was still 2 star systems out from Nexara. It was a formal communication from the Galactic Conclave of 17 species, printed in the standard diplomatic script that every spacefaring civilization had agreed to use because nobody could agree on anything else. It was 42 pages long. The first page listed the parties involved. The second page contained what the Conclave called a summary of grievances. The remaining 40 pages were the grievances themselves, numbered, cross-referenced, and annotated with citations going back 200 years. I had read it the first time with mild interest, the second time with genuine attention. The third time I had laughed so hard that Owen had knocked on my cabin door to check whether I had lost my mind. I had not lost my mind. I had simply reached the point where the absurdity of the situation became too obvious to ignore. The Galactic Conclave had been watching humanity for a long time, since before we broke out of our own solar system actually, though we did not know that then. They had observed us from a careful distance and made notes and held careful discussions among their 17-member species about what to do with us. They had debated, deliberated, and drafted frameworks. They had assigned committees. And then, before any of those committees had finished their reports, humanity had done what humanity tends to do, which is to stop waiting for permission and start building things. We had left the solar system 49 years ago, not with a single grand mission or a carefully planned expedition, but in the way most human things happen, which is messily and all at once and in several different directions simultaneously. A mining company sent a probe to a nearby star system to check the resource density. A university research team followed because the probe found something interesting. A private colony ship left 6 months later because a group of people decided they did not want to live on Earth anymore. A military escort accompanied the colony ship because nobody could agree whether that was a good idea, and they sent one anyway just to be safe. Within 20 years, we had settlements on 4 worlds outside our solar system. Within 30 years, we had 17. Within 40 years, the number had stopped being easy to keep track of. The Conclave had watched all of this with increasing unease. They had protocols for first contact. They had careful, measured frameworks for introducing pre-spaceflight species to galactic civilization. They had centuries of careful tradition about how expansion was supposed to work, which involved slow introductions and supervised development and a lot of waiting. Nobody had told us. We had not expanded into space because the conclave allowed it. We had expanded because the problems at home were significant, and the universe was large and humans are, at their core, a species that responds to any door marked "Do Not Enter" by asking why, and then building a better door. The charges in the document were, objectively speaking, impressive. We had terraformed 9 worlds that the conclave had classified as protected. We had done this not because we knew they were protected, but because nobody had told us, which the conclave apparently considered an insufficient excuse. We had made contact with 4 pre-spaceflight civilizations on our own initiative and shared technology with them, which violated something called the doctrine of natural galactic order, a rule that existed because 17 species had once agreed that civilizations should develop at their own pace without outside interference. We had accidentally intervened in 3 separate interspecies conflicts simply by establishing trade routes through disputed territory, which caused the losing sides in those conflicts to see new strategic possibilities and fight back with unexpected success. The conclave found all of this deeply troubling. The document said so in very careful, very formal language 17 times. What the document could not quite bring itself to say, but what I had sensed in every line of it, was something simpler than outrage, something that sat underneath the legal language like a current under ice. They were not angry. They were afraid. I had known this before I read the charges. I had known it the moment the invitation arrived, because they had called it a summons and given us no option to decline, but they had also sent a comfortable transport and provided food that a human could actually eat, and included a polite note from the conclave secretariat explaining the docking procedures. You do not treat something you simply want to punish with that kind of care. You treat it that way when you want to make sure it arrives in a reasonable mood. The corridor ended at a pair of doors that were each 20 feet tall and made of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone. They opened inward as we approached, without sound, without visible mechanism, as if the station had simply decided to let us through. The reception chamber beyond was smaller than I had expected. It held 6 beings from 4 different species, all of whom I recognized from the briefing files Owen had prepared. They were not hostile. They were precise, careful, and watched me the way you watch something you are not entirely sure is safe to be near. An ambassador from the Vethali spoke first, in the translated common tongue that came through my earpiece as slightly flat and deliberate. Captain Voss, welcome to Nexara Station. The conclave will convene in the morning session. You will be provided quarters, meals, and access to the archive reference terminals. Thank you, I said. He paused for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said something that was not in any script. We have been observing your kind for 50 years. I know, I said. You are not what we expected. I looked at him directly. He had 4 eyes arranged in a wide arc across a face that suggested his species had evolved to see threats coming from multiple directions at once. Right now, all 4 of those eyes were focused on me. What did you expect? I asked. He did not answer. He turned and led us toward the quarters corridor, and I followed, and Owen fell into step beside me and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. That night I lay on a bed that was slightly too long for a human and stared at the ceiling of the station and listened to the hum of it, the vast mechanical breathing of a structure that had been built by 17 species over 400 years. It was old in a way that very few human things were old. It had seen civilizations rise and make their decisions and face their consequences. Tomorrow it would see us make ours. I was not afraid. That is the part I want to be clear about. because everything that follows might seem like the story of someone who was. I was not. I was something else. I was curious. Because whatever the conclave thought they were about to do to humanity, I had read 42 pages of their fears dressed up as accusations, and I had a very strong feeling that this trial was not what it appeared to be. I was right, but I did not yet know how deeply right I was, or what it would cost, or what it would mean for every living thing in the galaxy. I closed my eyes. The station hummed around me like a held breath. In 8 hours, I would walk into the conclave chamber and hear every terrible, true, frightening thing humanity had ever done read back to me in careful detail. And I would sit there and I would listen, and I would not look away. Because that is what we do. The chamber was circular. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the 17 thrones arranged around the outer ring, not the vast obsidian ceiling that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, not the fact that I was the only human in a room that held beings from worlds I could not have found on a map 2 generations ago. What I noticed first was the shape of the room. Circular, with no head, no foot, no seat of obvious authority, every position equal, every occupant facing every other. It was a design meant to suggest fairness. I sat in the single chair placed at the center of the floor. Owen sat in the observer gallery above, along with 3 other members of our diplomatic staff. He had given me a small nod as I walked in, which I took to mean everything is fine, and also I am extremely concerned, but I am not going to show it. I took my seat. 17 species looked at me. There was the Vethali delegation, tall and silent, who I had already met. There were the Keth-Moron, whose bodies were broad and dense like something that had evolved under heavy gravity, which they had. There were the Is-Karath, the oldest continuous civilization in the known galaxy, represented by a single elder whose age my briefing file listed as approximately 14,000 years, a number so large my brain simply refused to process it as real. There were 12 other species, some of whom had forms I could describe, and some of whom were better understood as presences than as bodies, filling their sections of the ring with color or light, or a vibration that my translator converted into something approximating language. The conclave chair was a Keth-Moron named Eric-Saul, which my earpiece rendered phonetically. She was the first to speak. "This session is formally opened," she said. "The matter before the conclave is the conduct of the species designated humanity, originating from the 3rd planet of the star Sol, space designation H1, presently occupying or having influenced no fewer than 47 star systems within the boundaries of recognized galactic space." A pause. "Captain Voss, you are present as the designated representative of your species. You are here to hear the conclave's findings, to respond if you choose, and to receive the conclave's determination." "Understood," I said. "Do you have questions before we begin?" "Just one," I said. "Is there water anywhere?" It was a long walk. Someone in the observer gallery made a sound. I could not tell if it was Owen suppressing a reaction or one of the alien observers registering something their species used as an emotional response. The conclave chair looked at me for a long moment, then made a small gesture. A Vethali aide appeared with a container of water and placed it beside my chair. "Thank you," I said. Eric-Saul began. For the next 6 hours I listened. The catalogue of human transgressions, as it came to be called in the records, was not a document I had seen before, though it was built from sources our own historians had access to. It was the conclave's version of our history, assembled from their observation data, their diplomatic records, and the reports of the species we had encountered. It was, in its way, extraordinarily thorough. They described the terraforming first. 9 worlds, classified under the conclave's protected status framework, had been altered by human settlers. The alterations ranged from significant to total. One world, which the conclave's records showed had been in the early stages of developing what might have become atmospheric chemistry suitable for simple organic compounds in approximately 800,000 years, had been converted in less than a decade into a functioning agricultural colony. A human engineer named Clara Webb, who had led the terraforming project, had apparently written in her log that the planet had needed a bit of help. The conclave read this quote into the record with what I can only describe as a kind of exhausted disbelief. I kept my face still. They moved to the uplift incidents. 4 species, all at pre-spaceflight levels of development, had received contact and in some cases direct technological assistance from human explorers who had found them interesting. The arguments those explorers had made at the time, according to our own records, ranged from they seemed to want it to we had already landed, and it felt rude not to share. One of them, a geologist named Pete Hale from New Zealand, had apparently introduced the concept of radio communication to a civilization that was roughly at the level of early industrialization, because they reminded him of us, and he thought they deserved the same chances we had. The conclave's reading of this was that Pete Hale had violated the sovereignty of a developing civilization and potentially redirected the entire trajectory of their cultural development. Pete Hale's own record of it was that he had stayed for 3 months, taught some basics, and left with what he described as a very warm send-off and an excellent meal he still thought about. I drank some water. The 3 conflict interventions came next, and these were the most complex, because none of them had been deliberate. We had simply moved through space in ways that happened to intersect with existing tensions, and our presence had changed the calculations. In one case, a species that had been on the verge of surrendering a disputed territory had seen a human trade convoy pass through the system and drawn the conclusion that larger civilizations were paying attention, which gave them a reason to hold out. They held out. They eventually won. The conclave considered this a significant destabilization. I considered it a coincidence, but I did not say so yet. Hour 4 was when the testimony shifted. A representative of the Is-Karath, the ancient species, was given the floor. The elder moved to the speaking position with a slowness that was not weakness but deliberateness, as if every movement had been considered before being made. They had lived 14,000 years. They had seen the conclave form. They had watched species rise and collapse and leave nothing behind but star charts and silence. They spoke for 40 minutes. What they said was this: in the history of the conclave, 17 species had been assessed for what the Is-Karath called civilizational trajectory concerns. It was a formal category. It meant a species whose expansion patterns, rate of development, or behavioral tendencies suggested they might become a destabilizing force in the broader galactic community. Of those 17, 12 had been placed under varying degrees of restriction. 4 had voluntarily accepted guided integration frameworks. 1 had refused all contact and had not been heard from in 600 years, which the conclave had decided to file under unresolved. Humanity was the 18th case. But said the elder, in the 63 years of observing humanity, the conclave had noted something for which they had no existing category. We were not hostile. We were not expansionist in the way that word was usually understood, which implied deliberate conquest. We did not appear to be following a strategy. We did not appear to be following anything. We moved like water, finding every low point and filling it, not because we had been directed to, but because it was the nature of water to move. Your species, the elder said, in a voice that sounded like something very old settling into place, is the first we have observed that treats an extinction-level threat as an engineering problem. The chamber was quiet. I thought about my grandmother. She had lived through 2 floods that took her home and rebuilt both times. She had a saying about it that I had grown up hearing and not understanding until I was much older. She used to say, "The water takes what it takes, and then you get on with it." I did not say that, I just sat there. Because what the elder had said, framed as a concern, a worry, a potential mark against us, had landed on me differently than they had intended. I heard it not as a criticism, but as the most accurate description of humanity I had ever heard from someone who was not human. We don't stop, not because we are brave or because we are reckless, but because the alternative is to stop, and stopping does not come naturally to a species that was built on 10,000 years of looking at an impossible situation and asking what if we tried anyway. The conclave spent the next hour presenting its evidence in careful, methodical detail. More quotes from human engineers and explorers and settlers, each one read with the same tone of careful alarm, each one landing on me like a small recognition. The woman who had said you can always find another solution if the first one does not work. The pilot who had logged I am not sure this is going to function, but we are going to find out. The Colonial Council chair who had written into the official record that the conclave's guidelines were, with respect, deeply unimaginative. Hour 6 arrived, and I had not spoken since asking for water. Arixal looked at me from across the chamber. Her expression was unreadable in the way that some very experienced people become unreadable, not blank but controlled. "Captain Voss," she said, "you have heard the conclave's findings. Do you wish to respond?" I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Everything you read is accurate." A shift in the room, subtle, the kind of shift that happens when people have prepared for an argument and do not receive one. "Everything you read is accurate," I said again. "Clara Webb did call it a bit of help. Pete Hale did stay 3 months. The convoy through the Deck-Veth corridor did change the calculation. I am not here to tell you any of it was wrong." I paused. "I am here to listen to what you decide to do about it." Arixal looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The conclave will adjourn until the morning session, at which point the formal determination will be delivered." Everyone stood, or rose, or shimmered depending on their particular form of movement. Owen appeared at my side as I walked toward the exit corridor. He matched my pace, said nothing for the first 30 seconds, and then quietly, "That went either very well or very badly." "Yes," I said. "Which one?" I thought about the elder's words, about the way the conclave had watched us for 63 years and built 42 pages of fear and dressed it in legal language and summoned me here to hear it read back. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I know they didn't bring us here just to punish us." Owen thought about that for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because if they just wanted to punish us," I said, "they wouldn't have spent 6 hours explaining why they're afraid of us first." We walked back through the amber-lit corridor in silence. Somewhere ahead, the station hummed its vast mechanical note. Somewhere behind, 17 species were adjourning to deliberate on the fate of humanity. I drank the last of my water and handed the empty container to Owen. "Get some rest," I said. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting." They delivered the sentence in the morning. Arixal read it in the same measured voice she had used for everything else, as if tone were a fixed quantity she had decided on long ago and saw no reason to adjust. The formal determination of the Galactic Conclave of 17 species regarding humanity was a thing called mandated rollback. She explained it carefully. The human colonial program would be frozen. All settlements beyond the home solar system would be placed under conclave supervision. Human technology development would be reviewed and, where necessary, restricted. Contact with other species would be permitted only through conclave-approved diplomatic channels. The framework would remain in place for a minimum of 500 years, at which point the conclave would conduct a review. 500 years. I sat in the center chair and listened to every word of it, and I kept my face completely still, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing that looks like punishment but has the shape of something else. Rollback, containment, isolation dressed up in careful language. It was not an execution. It was a cage built to last longer than anyone currently alive would survive to see opened. I said nothing. The session closed. The Vethali guards came to escort me back to the diplomatic quarters, and I went with them without argument, without comment, without the reaction they had probably prepared for. Owen fell in beside me. He was silent, which meant he was processing, which in Owen meant about 40 seconds before a question came. 38 seconds. Are we appealing? No, I said. Are we? Wait, I said. He waited. We reached the quarters. The door closed behind us. I sat down at the small table and looked at the surface of it for a moment, because the surface of the table was neutral, and I needed neutral while I arranged my thoughts. Then the knock came. It was not the knock of a Vethali guard. It was 3 short, precise sounds, evenly spaced, which was apparently how the Kethmoron indicated a private request for entry. I had read that in a cultural briefing file once and not thought I would ever need it. I opened the door. Erixal stood in the corridor, alone, no guards, no aid, no recording device that I could see. She was large in the way her species was large, built like something designed to endure, and she looked at me with the expression I had been trying to read since I arrived and had not been able to place. Now, up close, I placed it. Exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a long day, the exhaustion of a long time. May I enter? She asked. Yes, I said. Owen stood from his chair automatically, reading the situation, and said he would wait in the corridor. He stepped out. The door closed. Erixal took the chair across the table from me and sat in it with the care of someone whose bones had carried a great weight for longer than they would admit. What I am about to tell you, she said, is not part of the official record. It is not part of any record. What you do with it is your decision, but you should understand that this conversation does not exist in the documentation of this session. Understood, I said. The determination you heard this morning was real, she said. It stands. If you return to human space and report it as the final outcome of these proceedings, that will be accurate. No one will say otherwise. She paused. But there is another conversation, one that the conclave has not had the language for until now. She placed her hands flat on the table. Kethmoron hands were wide and pale, and they had more joints than human hands, and right now those hands were pressed flat as if she needed the surface to anchor herself. My species has not gone to war in 41,000 years, she said. We have built our civilization around the principle that conflict is the failure of reason. We are not passive. We are not naive. We are careful. We make decisions slowly and we make them well, and we have not been wrong very often. She looked at me directly. I am telling you this so you understand the weight of what I am about to say. All right, I said. There is something coming, said Erixal, something that none of us can stop. The room was very quiet. We have known about it for a long time, she said. Not always clearly, not always with certainty, but for 800,000 years there has been a pattern at the edge of what is observable, a pattern that moves, that consumes, that leaves nothing. She pulled a small data crystal from somewhere inside her robe and set it on the table between us. It was dark, no larger than my thumbnail, and it held, as I would later learn, the most terrifying archive ever compiled by any spacefaring civilization in this galaxy. We call it the silence, she said, because that is what it leaves behind. 6 galaxies so far, 6 galaxies that were producing signals and now produce none. We have observed the edges of its movement. We have tried to calculate its path. She stopped. She looked at the data crystal for a moment. We have 17 species, she said. Some of us have been spacefaring for hundreds of thousands of years. We have the most advanced propulsion in this galaxy. We have weapons that can alter the structure of small stars. We have the accumulated science of more civilizations than you have names for. She looked up at me. We have tried 17 times to develop a response that could work. 17 different approaches, built by the best minds our combined civilizations have produced. I waited. None of them worked, she said. Silence. Not because we lacked resources, she continued. Not because we were not serious, because the silence does not operate by rules we understand. Every model we built assumed that it responded to physical laws. It does not. Or if it does, the laws it responds to are not the ones we have discovered. She folded her hands. We have 17 species and 800,000 years of collective history, and we cannot solve this problem. I looked at the crystal on the table between us. How long do we have? I asked. Our best projections suggest between 400 and 600 years, she said, though our models have been wrong before and never in the more favorable direction. I thought about that. 400 years. Longer than most things humans built lasted, but not so long that you could pretend it was someone else's problem. The trial, I said slowly. The charges, the catalog. Yes, she said. That was not just about what we did. No, she said. You wanted to see what we are. She looked at me with the exhausted, careful expression of someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had finally found someone to put part of it down with. We needed to understand, she said, whether your species was simply disruptive or whether you were the kind of disruptive that survives things that are not supposed to be survivable. I sat with that for a moment. The elder's words from yesterday came back to me. Your species is the first we have observed that treats an extinction-level threat as an engineering problem. Not a criticism. A job description. You were not summoned here to be punished, said Eric Saul. You were summoned here because we have been out of ideas for longer than your civilization has existed, and you are the first thing we have encountered in 400,000 years that we do not know how to predict. She leaned forward slightly. We are not asking you to save us. We are not certain you can. We are not certain anyone can, but we needed to know if you were the kind of species that would try. I looked at her. 14,000 years of combined history sitting across a table from 39 years of someone who grew up in the rain. Can I take the crystal? I said. Yes, she said. And the determination, the rollback. It stands, she said. Officially, we cannot remove it without a full session vote and the reasoning would have to be disclosed. This conversation cannot be part of that. Understood, I said. She stood, she moved toward the door, then she stopped. There is one more thing, she said. The species the silence has already consumed. There are remnants, signal fragments, data buried in the background radiation of the regions it has passed through. We have looked at them. We have not been able to interpret them. She did not say anything further. She did not need to. I was already thinking the same thing she was. Leave that in the crystal too, I said. She nodded once, and then she left, and the door closed, and I sat alone with the small dark stone on the table in front of me, and I thought about water, and about doors marked "Do Not Enter," and about a grandmother who rebuilt the same house twice and called it simply getting on with it. Owen opened the door after a few seconds. He had been standing close enough to understand the tone without the words. He looked at the crystal. We're not going home empty-handed, are we? He said. It was not a question. No, I said. What do we do with it? I picked up the crystal. It was lighter than it looked, which seemed wrong given what it contained. We go home, I said. We sit down with the people who are good at impossible things, and we start working. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay even, the silence, that is what she called it. Yes. And 17 civilizations couldn't find a way to stop it. Correct. He thought about this carefully, but they haven't tried the human approach yet. I stood up, put the crystal in my pocket and looked at the door. No, I said, they haven't. I landed on Earth on a Thursday. By Friday morning, I was in the first meeting. By Sunday evening, there had been 9 more, held in 4 different cities, with participants ranging from physicists to engineers to ecologists to a retired admiral named George Webb who had spent 40 years doing things that were not supposed to be possible, and had a file so long that the classification level needed its own abbreviation. The data crystal had been copied to secure servers within 6 hours of landing. The contents had been distributed to 11 research teams within 12. Owen had once described humanity's problem-solving process as organized chaos with good intentions. He was being polite. What actually happened when we brought the silence data home was closer to a controlled explosion. Every team that received the data asked the same first question, which was how has nothing tried to engage with this directly, and the answer was that the conclave's 17 species had all approached it as a force to be blocked, a wall to be built against. They had thought in terms of defense, which made sense for civilizations that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to be careful and measured and thorough. We thought about it differently almost immediately. Not because we are smarter. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The Iskareth Elder was 14,000 years old and had a mind that operated in dimensions I could not fully follow in translation. The Keth moron had built instruments capable of measuring changes in spacetime so subtle that they made our best equipment look like a stick in the dirt. Every species in that conclave had resources and history and scientific depth that we had not yet come close to matching. The difference was not intelligence. The difference was that we had not yet had enough time to learn which things were supposed to be impossible. The first real breakthrough came from an unlikely direction. A team at a research station on Titan, led by a physicist named Nina Crane who had been studying extragalactic signal patterns for 11 years, looked at the silence data and noticed something that every previous analysis had missed, not because the others lacked the tools to see it, but because they had been looking for something complex. What Nina found was simple. The silence had a rhythm. Not a regular rhythm, not the kind you could set a clock by, but a rhythm nonetheless. A pattern of advance and pause and advance that was irregular on the surface but contained, buried inside it, a sequence. It was the kind of pattern that was invisible if you assumed the thing making it was moving with purpose, because purpose implied strategy and strategy implied unpredictability. But if you assumed the thing making it was not strategic but reactive, something that moved in response to conditions rather than toward goals, then the pattern became visible. Nina sent her findings at 2 in the morning, and by 4 in the morning she had replies from 6 teams across 3 planets. By noon, the first competing interpretations had arrived. By the following morning, there were 14 separate models, each building on the previous, each slightly sharper. I was not in those rooms. I was in a different set of rooms, making a different kind of argument. Because the data crystal had contained something else, the thing Eric Saul had mentioned last, the remnant signals from the species the silence had already consumed. Ghost data, as my team started calling it. Fragments of transmission buried in the background radiation of regions that had gone quiet. Not much. Not enough to reconstruct anything complete, but enough, possibly, to hear something. I put together a team of 7 people. A linguist named Diana Cole, who had spent 20 years working on non-human communication patterns. An acoustic engineer named Frank Reeves, who had developed new methods for isolating signals from degraded data. A xenobiologist named Priya Shah, who had done more original work on non-carbon-based intelligence frameworks than anyone alive. A data archaeologist named Leon Carter who had, as his main qualification, an almost unreasonable tolerance for spending months on puzzles that might yield nothing. Plus 3 technicians whose names I will not list here because they asked me not to, for reasons that are their own. We set up in a research facility outside Bristol. We started listening. The ghost data was not clean. It was not even close to clean. It was like trying to hear a whisper in a room where a storm had been playing for 800,000 years. Frank spent the first 3 weeks just building the filters. Diana spent those same 3 weeks developing frameworks for what a distress signal might look like across vastly different communication systems. Priya cataloged every known form of intelligence signature and built a reference library from scratch. Leon ate biscuits and stared at data and said nothing useful until the morning of the 22nd day, when he sat up straight and said, "They were talking to each other." We all stopped. "The fragments," he said, "they're not distress signals. They're not transmissions into space. They're conversations between each other, between the species that were being consumed." He pulled up the display and showed us. The fragments, when mapped against each other, were not isolated. They had timestamps that overlapped. They had frequency patterns that suggested listening and responding back and forth between different sources in different locations. They were comparing notes, he said. In the last period before the signals went dark, they were talking to each other as fast as they could, trying to share what they knew, trying to figure it out together. Diana looked at the map for a long time. Then she said quietly, "They almost got there." Everyone turned. She pointed to a cluster of signals in the final hours of the dataset, the most recent fragments, the ones just before the silence became total. The density of exchange had spiked. The signals had become shorter and faster, which in communication terms meant the kind of urgent shorthand that develops when people are trying to say a great deal in very little time. "Whatever they found," Diana said, "they found it very near the end, and they were trying to pass it on before they couldn't anymore." I looked at the data. 800,000 years of silence, and somewhere inside it, a group of civilizations that had looked the end in the face and in the last moments tried to warn someone. They had aimed that warning at nothing, at empty space, at a galaxy that had not yet developed the tools to receive it. Until now. We spent the next 4 months decoding. It was not fast work. It was not clean work. It was the most painstaking, frustrating, magnificent work I had ever been part of, sitting in a room in Bristol listening to voices that had been silent for longer than humans had walked upright, trying to hear what they had known. What we found in the end was not a weapon. It was not a shield. It was not a grand tactical framework. It was a map. Not a map of space, a map of the silence itself. The civilizations that had been consumed had, in their final period, managed to understand something about the structure of the thing they faced. Not everything, not enough to save themselves, but enough to leave a trail for whoever came after. They had mapped the parts of the silence that were not silent. The soft points, the thresholds, the places where its pattern paused and reset. The places where, theoretically, something could be done. Nina's rhythm, Diana's conversations, the map. 3 separate discoveries, made by 3 separate teams, none of whom had been looking for the same thing. Together, they were something. Not enough, not yet, but something. I sat in the Bristol facility the night we finished the first complete version of the assembled model, and looked at it on the display and thought about the Conclave's 17 species and their 17 failed attempts. They had built walls. They had planned defenses. They had tried to stop a force they did not understand by throwing things at it and hopping. We were not going to build a wall. We were going to seed the galaxy with 10,000 listening stations, each one networked, each one designed to track the rhythm Nina had found, each one capable of identifying the soft points as they moved and broadcasting the coordinates in real time. Not a defense line. A distributed nervous system, a way of knowing where the silence was going before it arrived. And then, at the soft points, we were going to send something it had never encountered before. Not a weapon, not a wall. A signal, shaped like the ghost data, shaped like the last transmissions of the civilizations it had already consumed. Because if the silence was reactive, if it moved in response to conditions rather than toward goals, then it had at some point been in contact with the minds of hundreds of civilizations. It had taken them, and in doing so, it had also, in some sense, heard them. We were going to speak to it in the only language it had ever been taught. I brought this back to Nexara 18 months after the trial. Owen came with me. Nina came with me. Diana and Frank and Leon came with me. We walked back into that amber-lit corridor and through those tall, dark doors and into the conclave chamber, and we set our findings on the table. Eric-Saul looked at the data for a very long time. Then she looked at me. How, she said, and it was not a question. Nina found the pattern, I said. Diana found the conversations. Leon found the map. Frank built the filters that let us hear any of it. In 18 months, she said. We work quickly when we are interested, I said. She looked at the model, at the map, at the network proposal. The bioluminescent representative from one of the species I had not properly met the first time flickered through a sequence of colors. My translator gave me a single word for the full sequence. Impossible. I know, I said. I looked around the chamber. 17 species. Hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated civilization. The most powerful, most ancient, most sophisticated community of minds that had ever existed in this part of the universe. We know, I said again. I looked at Eric-Saul. We are going to do it anyway. Nobody in the room spoke. The silence lasted long enough that it became a kind of answer. Then Eric-Saul did something I had not expected. She looked not at the data but at the humans in the room, all 6 of us. Nina with her notes, Frank with his filters already half redesigned in the margins of his copy, Leon eating a biscuit because he genuinely did not know what else to do with his hands in formal settings. And she said, "What do you need from us?" That was the moment I had been waiting for, not the one I had planned for, not the one any of us had expected. But I had learned, a long time ago, that the moments that matter most are rarely the ones you plan. We need your data, I said. All 17 sets of observational records going back as far as they go. We need access to the ghost signal regions. We need your fastest ships to start seeding the first 1,000 stations. And we need your best people working beside ours because this is going to take all of us. Another silence. Then from somewhere to my left, the ancient Is-Kareth elder, who had not moved once during the entire session, spoke for the first time. Yes, they said, just that. A single word in a voice like something very old agreeing to continue. I exhaled. Owen behind me very quietly said, "There we go." There is a moment, just before something very large begins, where time seems to slow down without actually changing. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the ordinary sensation of a person standing at the edge of a decision that cannot be undone, and the world around them is perfectly still, and the next breath is the last one that belongs entirely to the world that came before. I know that moment well by now. I have stood in it several times. The first time was on the morning the silence arrived. It arrived 412 years earlier than the Conclave's best model had predicted, not by a small margin, by 4 centuries, which meant either the model had a fundamental flaw, which Nina had been quietly suggesting for about 6 months, or the silence had accelerated for reasons that were not in any dataset we had. We got the signal at 04:17 station time. Owen was asleep. Most of the human contingent was asleep. I was not, because I had developed the habit of reading at odd hours in the years since Bristol, which was either a symptom of working too much or of thinking too much, and both were probably true. The signal came from one of our sentinel stations at the outer edge of the mapped region, Station 44. Frank had named it himself, which meant it had an unofficial designation scrawled on its deployment schematic that read the farthest flung and which nobody had objected to. Because by the time it was deployed, we had all developed the specific kind of attachment to inanimate machines that comes from asking them to do something terrifying on your behalf. The signal was 3 pulses. That meant confirmed contact. That meant the rhythm Nina had mapped was present. That meant it was here. 400 years early. I sat in the communications room with the pulse playing on repeat, and I thought about the elder's quote, the one I had turned over in my mind 100 times in the years since. Your species treats extinction-level threats as engineering problems. The engineering problem was now present. It had arrived without calling ahead. I woke Owen first, because I had worked with him long enough to know that his first reaction to impossible news was a moment of absolute stillness followed by a series of extremely focused questions, which was exactly what I needed. I then woke Nina, who said a single unprintable word, and was in the communications room within 4 minutes with her tablet already showing new calculations. I sent word to the Conclave Alert Team, which was a joint human and non-human group that had been assembled 18 months ago for exactly this eventuality. By 05:00 station time, the Conclave emergency session was convened. It was the first emergency session I had ever seen in which every single member arrived before the scheduled start. The Iskarath elder was already seated when I entered. I had never seen them move quickly before. I would not have said they could. Eric Saul opened the session without preamble. Station 44 has confirmed contact at the outer boundary. Current projection places the leading edge inside the galactic boundary within 22 standard months. All Conclave member fleets are at readiness status. She paused. The human network is active. Captain Voss. I stood. The Sentinel network is fully operational. We have complete coverage of the predicted advance corridor. Soft point mapping is current as of 6 hours ago. The signal team has the ghost data loaded and ready. I paused. We are ready. There was a moment in the room, not quite hope, not quite fear, something between them that has no clean name. The human proposal, said Eric Saul, has been reviewed and adopted by the full conclave. This is the strategy we are executing. She looked at me. Do you need anything from us before we begin? I thought about that, about the years since Bristol, about 42 pages of accusations that had turned out to be 42 pages of fear wearing the wrong clothes, about a data crystal smaller than my thumbnail, about Nina eating cold coffee at 2 in the morning saying she found something, about Leon staring at ghost signals and seeing conversations, about Diana pointing at the last desperate transmissions of a dead civilization and saying they almost got there, about the 18th throne that did not yet exist. No, I said, we have everything we need. The battle, if you can call it that, was not what any story would prepare you for. It was not ships firing weapons at a visible enemy. The silence did not look like anything in the way that you could point at it and say there, that is what we are fighting. It was an absence, a growing quiet at the edge of the detectable universe, a place where signals stopped and space continued, and the difference between the two was measurable only because we had built the tools to measure it. What we did was this. The Sentinel network tracked the advance in real time. The soft points shifted as the silence moved, which we had predicted it would do, and the network updated the map every 11 seconds, broadcasting the current coordinates to every human and conclave ship in the region. The conclave ships were there to carry our signal relays into position, because their drives were faster than ours at the distances involved, and because this was, at that point, the most genuinely collaborative thing any collection of spacefaring species had done in galactic history. The signal itself was Nina and Diana and Frank's work, a transmission built from the ghost data, structured like the last conversations of the consumed civilizations, shaped in a way that we hoped would be legible to something that had, in some form, heard those voices before. We did not know if it would work. We had good reasons to believe it might. Those are not the same thing, and I want to be honest about that. We lost 11 ships in the first wave. I will not make those losses small by rushing past them. 11 ships, crewed by human pilots who had volunteered for the relay positions closest to the advancing edge, because those positions needed to be occupied and someone had to occupy them, and they had made the decision themselves, without being asked. Their names are recorded. They will always be recorded. The fact that what they did contributed to the outcome does not reduce what it cost, and I refuse to write about it as if it does. The signal reached the first soft point at 19:44 station time on the fourth day. What happened next, Nina described later as the most exciting and terrifying 11 seconds of her life, which was saying something given the previous several years. The soft point, instead of closing and resetting in the usual pattern, paused, held. The rhythm stuttered. It was listening. We sent the second signal, then the third. The ghost data, the voices of the consumed civilizations, the conversations Diana had decoded, the map the survivors had built in the last moments before the silence took them. Everything they had managed to leave behind. We aimed it directly into the paused soft point and held our breath. The silence stopped. Not completely, not permanently, but it stopped its advance at the galactic edge for long enough that the conclave's greatest scientific minds, who had been monitoring every wavelength simultaneously, began recording data unlike anything they had ever seen. The silence was not responding to force. It was not responding to barriers or blockades or anything the conclave had tried in their 17 previous attempts. It was responding to the voices it recognized. We cannot fully explain this. I will not pretend we can. The working theory, which Nina has spent the years since refining, is that the silence is not intentional in the way we first assumed. It does not want to consume. It does not have goals in any strategic sense. It moves toward and through civilization the way a fire moves toward and through fuel, not because it chooses to, but because that is what it does with what it encounters. But fire can also be redirected. Fire changes its behavior when it encounters something it has already processed. We gave it something it had already heard. It did not stop permanently. We do not have a permanent solution yet. What we have is a delay, a significant one, long enough that we can build more of the network, improve the signal architecture, decode more of the ghost data, and try again. Each attempt teaches us more. Each attempt buys more time. Nina thinks, with the data she now has access to, that we are within a few attempts of finding the specific signal pattern that causes not just a pause but a full redirect, a change in trajectory large enough to open a corridor that the silence will not cross. She has been right about it before. After the advance stopped, after the conclave had verified the readings and the emergency alert was stood down, and the human teams had collapsed in their chairs with the specific relief of people who had been running on no sleep and high stakes for 4 days, Eric Saul called me into the conclave chamber. Just me. Not Owen, not Nina, not the team. Just me. The chamber was empty except for her. She stood in the center of the floor, the same place I had sat the first time when they had read me the charges. She looked at me for a moment. Then she did the thing I was not prepared for, not because I had not considered it might happen, but because seeing it was different from considering it. She lowered her head, not a slight nod, a full, deliberate bow. The Keth Moron do not bow easily. It is not a casual gesture in their culture. It is the gesture you make when you acknowledge that the debt you owe cannot be repaid in ordinary terms. We faced you in this chamber, she said. We called your history a list of violations. We were right about what you had done. We were wrong about what it meant. She lifted her head. We are begging you now, she said, not to save us. We understand you cannot guarantee that, but to let us stand beside you while you try. I looked at her. 14,000 years of careful, deliberate civilization and 39 years of northern English reign, standing on equal ground. You were always standing beside us, I said. You just didn't know it yet. The 18th throne was installed in the conclave chamber 3 weeks later. I did not attend the ceremony. I was in Bristol, back in the facility, sitting across from Nina and Diana and Leon and Frank, looking at the new data from the 4 days of advance and the 11 seconds of pause and everything the network had recorded in between. The ghost signals had yielded 3 more layers of information that we had not previously decoded. The map was more detailed than it had ever been. Leon was eating biscuits and saying nothing, which meant he was close to something. Owen sat beside me and did not ask questions, because he had learned to read the rhythm of a working room, which is one of the most useful skills a person can have. I looked at the data, at the voices of civilizations that had been silent for 800,000 years, finally being heard by someone who had the tools and the stubbornness and the specific inability to accept impossible as a final answer. Nina looked up from her screen. I think I have the redirect frequency. Nobody moved for a second. Then Frank said, "Show me." And we leaned in, all of us together. The galaxy was not saved yet. It was not safe yet. The silence was still at the edge of the mapped region, paused but not gone, and there was still a great deal of work to do and a great deal we did not yet understand. But we were closer than anyone had ever been. And we were not stopping. We never stop. That in the end is the thing the Conclave feared, and the thing that turned out to matter more than everything they had feared it for. We don't stop. Not because we are reckless, not because we don't understand the odds, but because stopping has never, in any moment of our existence, been the thing that kept us alive. The station hummed around us. The network listened at the edge of the universe. The ghost signals played in the background like a radio tuned to a station that no longer broadcast, but that we were slowly, carefully, imperfectly learning to answer. Owen put a cup of tea on the table beside me without being asked. I drank it. We got back to work.